Introduction. Born into fire, the silent truth behind every first cry. Why does a newborn enter the world crying? It is a moment we often romanticize, a celebration of new life, the first breath, the promise of a future untainted by the past. Yet the Buddha, in his first teaching after enlightenment, pointed to a truth far less sentimental: birth is suffering. This statement may seem unsettling, even cold. But it is not a denial of life's beauty, it is an invitation to look deeper. When the Buddha spoke of suffering, he wasn't merely referring to pain or misfortune. He was pointing to something far more subtle, universal, and inescapable: the restlessness embedded in our existence, the unsatisfied hunger behind every desire, and the quiet fear of loss behind every joy. Birth is not just a beginning, it is the starting point of impermanence, aging, separation, and death. The first cry of an infant is not taught, it is instinctive, raw, and real. It signals a truth that we spend most of our lives trying to avoid. To be born is to enter a cycle where suffering is not the exception, it is the rule. But this truth is not meant to lead us into despair. On the contrary, it is the foundation of wisdom. Only by seeing suffering clearly, from the moment of birth through every stage of life, can we begin to awaken. Not to reject life, but to live it with awareness, free from the chains of illusion. In the following sections, we will explore this truth, not as a dark pronouncement, but as a key to deep liberation. The journey begins with birth, but it doesn't end in sorrow. It ends in freedom. 1. Birth is suffering, a radical truth from the Four Noble Truths. When the Buddha first turned the wheel of Dharma, his teaching wasn't poetic, comforting, or even easy to accept. It was piercingly honest. In the very first of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, dukkha, he made a bold declaration: birth is suffering, jati pai dukkha. This wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't symbolic. It was a direct statement about the nature of existence itself. At first glance, this idea can feel extreme, even disturbing. Birth is often portrayed as a beautiful beginning, an innocent, hopeful entry into the world. We celebrate it with flowers, blessings, and joyful tears. But the Buddha urged us to look past these appearances. He wasn't dismissing the value of life, far from it. He was urging us to wake up from the dream that life is purely joyous and under our control. Birth, in the Buddhist view, is not just the start of life, it is the opening of the door to all the suffering that will inevitably follow. Let's break this down further. The term dukkha, often translated as suffering, doesn't just refer to pain in the physical sense. It refers to the deep dissatisfaction and unsettling nature of all conditioned existence. It's the tension between our craving for permanence and the reality of constant change. It's the discomfort that arises not only in physical pain or heartbreak, but also in subtle forms, like anxiety, regret, or the vague restlessness we feel even when things are going well. When the Buddha says birth is suffering, he is not only pointing to the biological trauma of being born, although that, too, is real. Consider what happens at birth. The fetus is pushed out of the womb through intense pressure, exposed to light, noise, air, and cold for the first time. No wonder the baby cries out. This is not a cry of celebration, it is a cry of discomfort, shock, and fear. That moment marks the start of a journey through a world filled with uncertainty, desire, loss, and aging. But more than that, birth marks the entry into samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Each birth sets the wheel in motion once again. With birth comes not just the promise of joy, but the guarantee of old age, illness, separation, and death. No one born into this world escapes these realities, no matter how privileged or protected they may be. Personal reflection: I used to think of suffering as something occasional, something that happened when things went wrong. Illness, heartbreak, failure, those were bad moments in an otherwise good life. But over time, especially through studying Buddhist philosophy, I began to see that suffering isn't just a rare disruption of happiness. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. Even in moments of joy, there's often a fear of losing what we have. Even in success, there's pressure to maintain it. This insight didn't make me gloomy, it made me more awake. It helped me appreciate joy without clinging to it and accept pain without being destroyed by it. Example. Think of someone who wins the lottery. At first, they're ecstatic. Life seems perfect. But soon, unexpected challenges arise. They may fear being taken advantage of. Relationships may change. They may begin to worry more about keeping what they have than enjoying it. The initial happiness fades, and a new form of suffering appears, one rooted in attachment, expectation, and fear. This, too, is part of what was set in motion at birth. So when the Buddha said birth is suffering, he wasn't denying life's moments of happiness, he was revealing their fragility. He was teaching us to look beyond the surface and understand the deeper laws that govern our experience. And most importantly, he wasn't asking us to despair, he was offering us a path. Only by fully recognizing the reality of suffering can we begin the journey to freedom from it. Denial keeps us trapped. Awareness sets us free. 2. Suffering begins the moment we are born. If birth is the doorway to suffering, then the moment we enter this world is not a fresh start in a blank notebook, it is the first line in a long chapter of struggle, change, and impermanence. The Buddha's teaching that birth is suffering becomes even more vivid when we contemplate what happens during and immediately after birth. Even before we are born, suffering has already begun. In the womb, the fetus does not live in a constant state of comfort. Buddhist texts often describe how the unborn child experiences discomfort through alternating heat and cold, pressure from the mother's movement, and even the sensations of hunger when the mother doesn't eat. These are early forms of suffering that mark the body's vulnerability and dependence, even before we take our first breath. When the time comes to be born, the trauma intensifies. The process of childbirth is physically violent for both mother and child. The baby is pushed through the narrow birth canal, experiencing immense pressure, sensory overload, and a sudden loss of warmth and protection. The body is exposed to air, light, and noise, all unfamiliar, all overwhelming. And what is the baby's first action upon arriving in this world? It cries. This cry is not taught, it is instinctive. It is the natural reaction of a being thrust into an unpredictable and harsh environment. It is the body's primal protest against suffering. Personal reflection. I once stood outside a maternity ward and heard the sounds of newborns crying in unison. For many, that would be a touching moment. But for me, it was a moment of realization. These tiny beings, untouched by the world's complexities, were already in distress. Not because something went wrong, but because this is the nature of beginning life in a human body. That moment helped me understand, in a very direct way, what the Buddha meant by saying birth is suffering. From that very moment of birth, suffering doesn't pause, it simply changes form. As infants, we are entirely dependent on others. Hunger, wetness, cold, and separation from the caregiver all cause emotional and physical distress. And we are unable to communicate these needs clearly. A baby cries not just from physical discomfort, but from the deep frustration of being unable to control or even understand its own experience. Example. Imagine an infant waking in the night, hungry and cold. The parent, exhausted, doesn't respond immediately. The baby cannot reason, cannot self-soothe. It only knows discomfort. Its crying is its only tool, and that cry contains a kind of existential despair, even if we don't recognize it as such. As we grow older, the suffering evolves. But the truth remains, suffering did not begin when something went wrong, it began with life itself. And not because life is inherently bad, but because this form of existence is marked by limitation, vulnerability, and change. The Buddha's insight is not meant to depress us, it is meant to wake us up. He's telling us, don't wait until you're older, or sick, or heartbroken to recognize the truth of suffering. It was there the moment you were born. And if you can see that clearly, then the path to understanding, and eventually to liberation, has already begun. 3. Suffering evolves and deepens as life progresses. The suffering that begins at birth does not disappear as we grow, it simply takes on new forms, becomes more complex, and often more hidden. The helpless cries of infancy gradually transform into silent anxieties, quiet despair, or invisible pressure as we step into the world. The Buddha's insight becomes increasingly apparent the more we live. Life, in all its stages, is marked by dukkha, a fundamental dissatisfaction that lingers even in our happiest moments. In childhood, suffering arises from powerlessness, dependency, and confusion. Children may seem carefree on the surface, but their inner world is filled with unknown fears and struggles: fear of being left alone, fear of punishment, the pain of not being understood, the frustration of not being in control. These experiences, though often dismissed as trivial by adults, shape the emotional landscape of our early lives. Personal reflection. I remember being 5 years old, hiding under a table after getting scolded. It wasn't the yelling that hurt, it was the feeling of being unloved, of being small and lost in a world I didn't understand. No one taught me that was suffering. No one called it dukkha. But it was. And even now, decades later, I can still feel the echo of it. As we move into adolescence, new forms of suffering emerge: identity crises, comparison, rejection, academic stress, and the awkward navigation of relationships. The body changes, the mind races, and the heart begins to ache in unfamiliar ways. We long to be accepted, to be enough, but the standards are often impossible, and the self-doubt relentless. Then comes adulthood, and with it a deeper, more refined kind of suffering. We are expected to be independent, successful, composed. But behind the polished exterior, many live with quiet despair. The pressure to achieve, the fear of failure, the weight of responsibilities, and the constant demands of modern life form an emotional burden that few dare to admit. Even when we have it all, suffering persists. A high-paying job may come with burnout. A stable marriage may hide emotional loneliness. Children may bring joy and deep worry at the same time. And even in moments of genuine happiness, there is an undercurrent of fears that it will end, that we might lose what we love, or that it was never truly ours to begin with. Example. Consider someone who works tirelessly for years to buy a house. The day they move in, they feel proud and satisfied. But soon, a new kind of stress arises: mortgage payments, repairs, fears of losing it in a financial downturn. What began as a symbol of comfort has now become a new source of anxiety. This is the cycle of suffering. We chase comfort, and in doing so, often inherit new forms of discomfort. Personal reflection. In my early career, I believed that success would erase my inner restlessness. But with each achievement came a new target, a new pressure, and a new fear of losing what I had gained. It wasn't until I encountered Buddhist teachings that I realized the chase itself was the suffering. I was trying to outrun the very thing I carried within me. As we age, physical suffering becomes more apparent: illness, fatigue, the slow loss of bodily strength. But perhaps more painful is the emotional and existential suffering: watching loved ones age or pass away, feeling irrelevant in a fast-moving world, or simply wondering, was it all worth it? The Buddha understood all of this, not because he read it in a book, but because he observed it in life itself. His path wasn't born from pessimism, it was born from deep, compassionate insight. He wasn't saying that life is only suffering, but that suffering is woven into every stage of life, no matter how successful, beautiful, or intelligent we are. This truth is not meant to scare us, but to liberate us. By recognizing how suffering evolves with us, we can stop blaming ourselves or others for our pain. We can begin to turn inward, to ask deeper questions, and to find a path that leads not to temporary relief, but to true peace. 4. The universal and inescapable nature of suffering. Perhaps the most humbling truth in the Buddha's teaching on suffering is this: no one is exempt. Suffering is not a curse laid upon the unfortunate, nor is it a punishment for the weak. It is a condition of existence itself. Whether one is born in a palace or a hut, a city or a village, with brilliance or simplicity, dukkha follows all. The Buddha taught that suffering is universal because the causes of suffering, attachment, craving, ignorance, impermanence, are universal. These conditions are built into the fabric of human life. No amount of wealth, fame, intelligence, or physical strength can completely shield us from them. Example. We often look at celebrities and assume they live blissfully free of the suffering we endure. But time and again, we see public figures struggling with depression, anxiety, addiction, or loneliness. They may have achieved everything the world told them would bring happiness, and yet feel empty inside. Why? Because suffering doesn't come from what we have, but from how we relate to the nature of our existence. Even in our personal lives, we see this truth repeated. The friend with the perfect job is terrified of losing it. The person in a happy relationship fears abandonment. The healthy person fears illness. The wise person, though they may see deeper, still feels the sting of parting and the weight of impermanence. Personal reflection. There was a time when I thought, once I fix this problem, I'll be happy. And for a moment, I would be. But soon, a new problem would arise. Then another. Eventually, I realized it wasn't the problems themselves that were the issue, it was the expectation that life should be free of problems. That expectation created the suffering. Life was never the problem. My resistance to it was. What makes this suffering so persistent is its subtlety. It doesn't always come in dramatic waves. Often, it hides in the background, like a low hum beneath the noise of daily life. It shows up as restlessness, boredom, comparison, or the nagging sense that something is missing. Even when we have everything, we may still feel incomplete. And this incompleteness isn't unique to us, it's shared by all. When we truly understand this, something profound happens, compassion is born. We stop judging others harshly. We stop assuming others have it easier or better. We start to see the pain in their smiles, the weight behind their eyes, the invisible battles they fight daily. Example. One day, I was in a cafe watching an elderly man sitting alone. He looked peaceful, even content. But when the waitress asked him how his day was going, he paused, and tears welled up in his eyes. "It's my wife's birthday," he said. "She passed away last year." That moment shattered the illusion. Even in silence, even behind a gentle smile, suffering can live quietly in the heart. This is the wisdom behind the Buddha's teaching. By acknowledging the universality of suffering, we begin to loosen our grip on self-centered thinking. We see that we are not uniquely broken, we are part of a shared human experience. And that insight can be incredibly healing. It frees us from envy, blame, and resentment. It humbles us. And it also empowers us to walk a path of mindfulness, kindness, and understanding, not just for our own liberation, but for the peace of others. 5. The goal is not to avoid birth, but to understand it deeply. When we hear the Buddha say, birth is suffering, a natural question may arise. Then should we wish never to be born? Is life itself a mistake? It's a fair question, one that even seasoned practitioners wrestle with. But the Buddha did not teach these truths to make us retreat from life. He did not encourage despair or nihilism. Quite the opposite, he offered these insights as the gateway to awakening, to help us live with wisdom rather than illusion. The problem is not birth itself. The problem is ignorance, not understanding the nature of birth, life, and suffering. We are born into a world governed by impermanence, craving, and change. But instead of seeing things clearly, we cling to fantasies of permanence and control. And it is this clinging, not life itself, that causes suffering. Personal reflection. For years, I tried to build a life free from discomfort. I thought if I just made the right choices, avoided the wrong people, got the right job, earned enough, stayed healthy, then I could avoid suffering. But no matter how carefully I arranged things, suffering found a way in. Illness came. People left. Dreams changed. It wasn't until I stopped trying to escape suffering and started trying to understand it that my inner landscape began to shift. The Buddha's path is not about running away from life, but about meeting life with clarity and compassion. We are not told to hate the world or wish we were never born. We are invited to observe, contemplate, and see through the illusions that keep us bound. Birth is not a punishment. It is an opportunity to grow in understanding, an opportunity to develop compassion for ourselves and others, an opportunity to see the truth of suffering, and through that seeing, discover the possibility of freedom. Example: a lotus cannot grow in pure water. It must rise from the mud. Likewise, our awakening is not in spite of suffering, it is born from it. The painful experiences of life, loss, grief, disappointment, fear, are not obstacles to the path, they are the path. Without birth, there would be no path at all. In this way, the Buddhist approach to suffering is neither pessimistic nor blindly optimistic. It is profoundly realistic. It doesn't offer escape, it offers liberation through direct, fearless awareness. And that begins with facing the simple, uncomfortable truth: to be born is to suffer. But to understand that fully is to begin to be free from it. So we don't run from birth, we wake up within it. We don't reject this human experience, we honor it by living it consciously. And through mindfulness, compassion, and insight, we transform suffering from a chain that binds us into a flame that illuminates our way. Conclusion: from birth to awakening. To be born is to step into a world of impermanence. From our first breath to our final exhale, we move through cycles of joy and sorrow, gain and loss, connection and separation. The Buddha did not veil this truth, he illuminated it. In declaring that birth is suffering, he was not condemning life, but revealing its fragile, fleeting, and conditioned nature, so that we might live not in delusion, but in wisdom. Suffering is not the enemy. It is the messenger. It invites us to look more deeply, to question our assumptions, and to let go of the attachments that bind us. Birth is not a curse, it is the beginning of the path. A path that leads, if walked with awareness, to a profound freedom that lies beyond birth and death. We cannot avoid the suffering that comes with being born into a human body. But we can learn to understand it, to embrace it without clinging, and to see through it with the eye of wisdom. When we do, suffering becomes less of a burden and more of a teacher. And through that teacher, we are slowly guided home, not to escape life, but to awaken within it. So let us not fear the truth that birth is suffering. Let us bow to it, steady it, live it mindfully, and in doing so, transform it into the doorway through which we discover the deepest peace.